To understand the Dark Souls timeline, start with a single event, the appearance of the first flame. Before it, the world was the Age of Ancients, a grey, timeless place of everlasting dragons and arching stone, where little change took hold. The flame brought disparity, heat and cold, life and death, light and dark. From that flame came powerful souls, and with those souls came the lords. 4 figures shaped what followed. Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight and War, bent lightning and founded a kin of gods. Nito, the first of the dead, mastered disease and death. The Witch of Izalith used the flame to create life and fireborn sorceries. A 4th, the Furtive Pygmy, claimed the Dark Soul, a subtle seed that would become humanity. Together, these lords used their newfound power to overthrow the dragons and build the Age of Fire. Kingdoms, grand cathedrals, and a fragile order that depended on the flame's warmth. The real mystery of Dark Souls is how that single spark forces repeated choices over centuries. Link the fire and delay the dark through sacrifice, or let the flame fade and accept a different world. Those decisions, and their inevitable consequences, are what loop through every kingdom and character that follows. The story that follows starts with what the first flame made possible, not only light and heat, but a fragmentation of power that produced a new political order. Those Lord Souls were not merely artifacts of strength, they mapped jurisdiction and destiny. Each Lord's ability shaped a role in the struggle ahead, and in the structure of the Age of Fire that would follow. Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight and War, became the visible face of that new order. His domain was electricity and force. Where the flame gave him a soul, he turned it into a weapon. He organized armies, forged alliances, and created a dynasty of gods and knights who would rule from high, luminous cities. Anor Londo, later the shining seat of his court, is the architectural expression of Gwyn's authority. Vaulted halls, sculpted statues, and a social order built around divine patronage. His power was expansionary, light that spread outward, imposing an ordered hierarchy on a world that had known only slow, pendulous stasis. Nito, the first of the dead, balanced that radiance with a darker function. He was not a mirror of Gwyn's brightness, but its necessary complement, the master of decay, disease, and graves. Nito's presence introduced the principle that death itself could be wielded as a force. In practical terms, that meant massed clouds of miasma, tombs and catacombs as instruments of war, and a metaphysical domain that legitimized endings as part of the cosmic order. Where Gwyn's light organized and protected life, Nito's domain regulated its cessation, and both duties were essential in confronting the everlasting dragons. The Witch of Izalith channeled fire into creation. Her contribution was generative. She experimented with fire to fashion new life and to develop sorceries that made combustion an art. That creative fire gave the lords another kind of leverage. Where Gwyn brought the blunt application of force and Nito brought the finality of death, Izalith supplied transformation, new magics that could reshape bodies, animate constructs, and alter the battlefield in ways brute strength could not. The 4th figure, the Furtive Pygmy, is the trickiest and most consequential for later ages. The Pygmy's Lord Soul was not a spectacle of lightning, rot, or flame, but a smaller, subtle core called the Dark Soul. It was a seed rather than a scepter. The Dark Soul was divided and passed down, and its fragments became what people later called humanity. That division made humans different from the lords, not lesser by accident, but by design. Humanity embodied a scattered, intimate power, capacity for cunning, for resilience, for small, persistent change that would play out over millennia in ways the gods did not anticipate. The Pygmy's gift set the stage for human agency and for patterns of desire that later fueled the cycle of linking and sacrifice. Those 4 functions, radiant war, necrotic authority, creative fire, and the seed of human darkness, were the tools the lords used against the everlasting dragons. The dragons were not merely beasts, but a geological, immovable order. Scales that made them seemingly eternal, bodies fused with the landscape, and a stasis that resisted both change and domination. The Lord's souls offered the precise variety of power needed to unseat that stasis. Gwyn's lightning shattered defenses and carved openings. Nito's deathly miasmas destabilized the dragon's cohesion. Izalith's firecraft created diversions and new weapons. And crucially, one of the dragons, Seath the Scaleless, betrayed his kind, fascinated by mortality and knowledge, and provided the lords with the understanding that made their victory possible. That betrayal matters for an obvious reason. It signals a turning point where the world's old equilibrium was not only challenged by external force, but dissolved by internal fracture. The dragon's immortality depended on their scales. Seath, lacking those scales, represents an existential exception. His collusion gave the lords a way to exploit the dragon's vulnerabilities. The result was decisive. The everlasting dragons were overthrown, their stony permanence broken, and the old era gave way to a deliberately constructed one. The immediate aftermath of that war was institution building. The lords did not simply enjoy victory and disperse. They used their authority to carve the map into kingdoms, to lay down new myths and civic orders, and to build monuments that anchored their rule. Lordran, and especially Anor Londo, became the physical and ideological center of the Age of Fire. Temples, fortress cities, and knightly hierarchies turned raw power into governance. Worship and law, religion and militarism, fused into a culture that treated the flame as both origin and obligation. But the Age of Fire did not appear as a stable, self-sustaining utopia. It was established on a condition. The flame, the very phenomenon that supplied the Lord's authority, was inherently transient. The first flame gifted disparity, hot and cold, life and death, light and dark. But disparity implies entropy. As the Lords consolidated their dominions, the flame that enabled them began a long, slow process of dimming. The pragmatic consequence of that dimming, what gives Dark Souls its tragic architecture, is that power under the Age of Fire required maintenance through sacrifice. Close to the point where the flame would falter, Gwyn and the other lords made the choice that defines the era. Rather than accept a slow descent into the dark the flame made inevitable, they linked their power to the flame and, in effect, tethered the world's prosperity to ritual acts of giving up power. Gwyn's sacrifice, whether understood as a single climactic act or an extended willingness to burn out and bind himself to the flame, is the model that follows through the series. By committing his strength to the first flame, he secured an extended period of light and civilization, but he also set a precedent. The continuation of the Age of Fire depends on continual renunciation. That renunciation both keeps the flame alive and institutionalizes loss. It turns rulership into stewardship by consumption. Kings and gods must be reduced to cinders to postpone the dark. So the end state of this first chapter is complex but concrete. The everlasting dragons have fallen. The lords have used the first flame to create an ordered world of kingdoms, temples, and gods, Gwyn's luminous court among them. Humanity has been seeded by the Dark Soul, a quiet, distributed power that will later shape rebellion and resilience. And embedded in the founding of that order is a structural fragility. The flame's inevitable fading forces a cycle of sacrifice that preserves the Age of Fire only at the cost of renewing the conditions that will make future choices necessary. That is the framework the later kingdoms inherit. A fragile prosperity built on power, divided among lords, and maintained by a precedent of costly linking. What follows from here is not inevitable peace, but a repeating question. Who will pay to keep the light, and who will refuse? Gwyn's precedent, binding the first flame by immolating himself and his allies, kept light in the world, but it also turned stability into a brittle practice. Linking the flame worked as a stopgap, not a cure. Over the centuries that followed, 3 linked failures eroded the Age of Fire from within. The Witch of Izalith's attempt to remake the first flame, Seath the Scaleless's betrayal and secret experiments, and Nito's withdrawal into death. Those failures weren't isolated accidents. They were structural responses to the same pressure, a diminishing source of power that rewarded desperate, irreversible acts. The result was decay, mutation, and a new metaphysical affliction for humanity, the Undead Curse. Izalith's attempt is the clearest example of how a solution became a catastrophe. As the first flame dimmed, the witch and her daughters tried to recreate it by reproducing the conditions of its original birth. Instead of resparking a stable, renewing flame, their ritual birthed the chaotic flame. The outcome was horrific and literal. The bed of chaos and a host of demons that corrupted the land and infected the legacy of firecraft. Izalith's daughters were twisted into demonic forms. Her temple city of Lost Izalith became a charred, broken ruin where the laws of life and death no longer held. What began as an attempt to preserve the Age of Fire instead birthed a rival fire that spent itself on destruction, further destabilizing the world. Seath's betrayal worked differently, but with the same ultimate effect. He corrupted knowledge into a tool that eroded the world's order. Born scaleless, and thus intrinsically different from the everlasting dragons, Seath allied with the Lords in return for secrets and a path to immortality. His obsession with eternal life and the manipulation of the material, crystals, flesh, and memory, produced arcane sorceries and monstrous experiments. In the Duke's archives and the Crystal Cave, he turned living matter into crystal constructs and propagated deformities that blurred the line between life and relic. Seath's work undermined natural mortality and warped the intellectual inheritance of the Lords. His betrayals and experiments seeded new forms of suffering and instability that outlived him. Nito, first of the dead, enacted the third template of decay by retreating into the domain of death itself. He personified mortality and disease, and his withdrawal into catacombs and tombs turned death into an organized, pervasive force. Where Izalith created chaotic, consuming fire, and Seath corrupted the living into crystalline static, Nito organized entropy and pestilence into armies and rites. Together, the three lords' failures fractured whatever unity the Age of Fire had briefly achieved. Fire, death, and corrupted knowledge now pulled the world apart along new fault lines. Those metaphysical breaks produced a practical, social consequence: the Undead Curse. As the flame waned, more humans bore the dark sign and became undead. Marked beings who could not die permanently and whose repeated resurrections eroded their minds and identities. Hollowing is the visible, psychological end state of that process, the loss of memory, purpose, and humanity itself. The mechanics are simple in description and devastating in effect. Every death healed by the flame, every respawn that keeps a body animate without resolving the underlying condition, pushes the bearer closer to hollowing. The first flame's diminishing meant fewer opportunities for meaningful renewal and more instances of unending existence. Humanity found itself in a loop where life's repetition led to erosion instead of restoration. This metaphysical crisis translated into political collapse. Anor Londo, the luminous seat of Gwyn's power, became a museum-quality facade propped up by illusion, Gwyndolin's sun magics and the maintenance of tradition, masking a hollowed court and a city populated by statues of what once was. Lordran's government and theology had to invent rituals, myths, and institutions to manage endless dying. Bonfires as small bastions of heat and memory, the Lord vessel to consolidate great souls, and the role of the chosen undead as a quasi-sacramental agent who might relieve or postpone the problem. Even these instruments were stopgaps. When chosen champions failed, or when the social cost of continuous linking became intolerable, cities faltered. Dark Souls 1 dramatizes this process as a cyclical ritual. Each time the flame dims, a new individual is prophesied or called, the chosen undead, to venture through corrupted kingdoms, reclaim Lord souls or the necessary power, and decide whether to link the flame or let it die. The sequence repeats across generations because the underlying conditions, dimmed fire, rising undead, and political institutions built around sacrifice, remain unchanged. Bonfires, offered as both mechanical checkpoints for the player and lore-wise manifestations of a fragmentary flame, anchor this cycle in the world. They keep fragments of fire alive, but they also institutionalize repetition. Rest at a bonfire, return to life, lose a little more. Dark Souls 2 expands the picture by showing how later kingdoms tried different, often bizarre solutions and failed. Drangleic is the clearest case study of political attempts to solve the curse without re-establishing Gwyn's precedent. King Vendrick rose to power in response to the spread of undead. He waged war on giants to secure resources and sought counsel from Aldia, a scholar who wanted to understand and possibly break the cycle. Their approach blended force and science. Vendrick consolidated power and relics. Aldia experimented on life, death, and the human condition. But the historical record, fragments, dialogue, and ruined architecture shows that their efforts either backfired or were subverted. Aldia's research went ethically dark. Vendrick's refusal to submit to linking left the kingdom militarized but metaphysically unhealed. Nashandra, a manipulative presence tied to darker primordial forces, exploited these fissures to seize influence. In the end, Drangleic shows how a kingdom can become ossified, defensive, and brittle when it treats the curse as a problem to be controlled rather than a symptom demanding a different kind of choice. Across these centuries, similar dynamics play out in other regions. Localized cults that worship fire or dark, factions that weaponize undead as labor or soldiers, and sanctuaries that hoard fragments of the flame in the hope of a future solution. The common denominator is the same fragility born at the founding of the Age of Fire. Every attempt to stabilize the world either consumes more of what remains of the flame or produces a new pathology, demons, crystal defects, or empire-wide hollowing that accelerates decline. That is how the world reaches the state we encounter in Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, an age of fire in terminal decline, with shards of order scattered among ruins. The gods' institutions are eroded, cities are hollowed, and humanity, branded and recurring, becomes the arena for an endless set of compromises. The flame still burns in places, and bonfires still grant brief respites, but those acts of preservation are themselves compounding the problem. So long as the first flame weakens, more people will be marked, and more kingdoms will pursue partial, often self-defeating solutions. The familiar motifs of repeated champions, ruined divine orders, and political experiments are not random. They are symptoms of a system designed to survive by consuming the very agents who might instead choose a different path. The immediate end state after this era is grim but precise. The first flame continues to fade, political and divine structures fragment or collapse, and the undead curse spreads. That combination forces repeated cycles of attempts, rekindling, manipulation, or scientific interference, each of which reshapes the world but never resolves the underlying tension. The next question becomes unavoidable. When a new contender stands before the dying flame, what will they choose? Sacrifice, refusal, or usurpation? And how will that choice rewrite the pattern that has governed the realm for generations? Dark Souls 3 takes the core question about the first flame: who will keep it burning, who will let it die, and who will try to seize it, and makes that question explicit. The climactic boss of the game, the soul of Cinder, is not just a hard fight. It's a statement. The role of the linker has become an institution. The soul of Cinder is an amalgam of every being who has ever sacrificed themselves to feed the flame. It wears pieces of Gwyn's armor, it moves with the fighting styles of past champions, and it exists to prove a point the series has been making all along. The cycle is institutionalized. Those who link the flame are not one-off martyrs. They become a repeating office that the world expects and reproduces. That institutionalization matters because it reframes the endings into political and metaphysical options rather than simple binary moral choices. Across the trilogy, players are offered three primary directions when they reach the dying flame: perpetuate it by linking the fire, let it die and accept whatever comes after, or seize its power and try to remake the rules. Each outcome is available in different forms across the games, but Dark Souls 3 lays them out most clearly. Understanding what those outcomes actually mean, for kingdoms, for gods, for human life, is the key to reading the full timeline. First, linking the flame. Historically, that was Gwyn's solution, a sacrifice that created the Age of Fire and the divine order centered on Lordran. When a new linker lights the flame again, they preserve the same basic mechanics that created the cycle in the first place. Practically, linking stabilizes a failing world. Bonfires burn again, warmth and light return, dragons will not re-emerge. The immediate collapse is delayed. But narratively and structurally, linking is also what has kept the system alive long enough to become self-destructive. Each linking consumes the strength and souls of individuals, and, over centuries, normalizes a sacrificial office that devours potential agents of change. Linking the flame reasserts the gods model, an economy of sacrifice in which civilization is purchased at the expense of human vitality and freedom. In the timeline, that choice extends the Age of Fire, but guarantees more cycles of hollowing, more institutions formed around preserving the flame, and more future linkers. Second, letting the flame die. This is the path hinted at in the original Dark Souls' Dark Lord ending, and echoed in several DS3 variations. If the flame is allowed to fade, the narrative implies a transition toward an Age of Dark, a period where humans, not gods, become the primary architects of what follows. The Age of Dark is ambiguous in tone because dark in Dark Souls is not simply evil, it's also associated with humanity, the deep, and the potential for spontaneous, unstructured growth away from divine law. Letting the flame die would end the cycle of enforced sacrifice, remove the institutional need for linkers, and potentially free the human paradigm from the gods' monopoly on power. But the risk is severe and uncertain. The flame's dying will not automatically produce a benevolent human age. Instead, it opens the world to unpredictable consequences, territorial collapse, new forms of suffering, and power vacuums that might produce worse tyrannies. The series explicitly refuses to romanticize this option. It offers emancipation at the cost of stability, and the moral calculus is intentionally murky. Third, usurpation. This is the option where a being does not simply perpetuate or refuse the flame, but attempts to take control of it and bend its mechanics to a new design. Dark Souls has several examples of attempts to manipulate or redirect soul power. Seath's experiments with immortality and crystal, Izalith's attempt to recreate the flame, Aldia's scientific projects in DS2, and the various political manipulations surrounding the Lords of Cinder in DS3. The usurpation of fire represents a deliberate, willful intervention. Seize the power that has long been the gods' monopoly and use it to forge a new order rather than submit to the old one. Narratively, usurpation promises agency. It promises a human-centered reconfiguration of metaphysics instead of submission to the cyclical economy of sacrifice. But it also carries the series' central warning. Power that attempts to circumvent the system almost always reproduces its worst dynamics. Seath's cold logic became monstrous. Izalith's experiment burned and birthed demons. Aldia's detachment produced more confusion than clarity. Usurpation risks creating an engineered replacement for the flame, a techno-magical solution that might stabilize one generation and doom the next. Why does From Software leave this unresolved? Because the core conceit of the series is that the problem is structural, not simply moral. The flame is both a literal source of heat and a metaphor for systems that demand sacrifice in exchange for stability. Any single ending can be read as an answer, but none erase the underlying mechanism that made the cycle possible. Scarcity, the centralization of power around an incomprehensible resource, and the institutionalization of sacrificial roles. By making the soul of Cinder a composite of past linkers, DS3 argues that the outcome of the flame is rarely determined by abstract morality. It is shaped by institutions, precedents, and the social logic that reproduces these roles. The games also show how partial attempts to solve the cycle tend to produce hybrid outcomes. Drangleic and the kingdom building in Dark Souls 2 are attempts to capture the benefits of order without fully resolving the curse. They borrow technology, rituals, titles, and laws from previous ages and end up perpetuating the problem. The Witch of Izalith and Seath are earlier prototypes of usurpation, technical attempts to recreate divine conditions that fail because they either lack the social legitimacy of sacrifice or the humility to accept its metaphysical costs. Those repeated failures are evidence that the timeline cannot be read as a serial progression toward one inevitable solution. Instead, it jerks between experimentation, retrenchment, and imitation. So how do these endings map onto the broader timeline? Link the Flame prolongs the Age of Fire and deepens the institutional pattern that led to kingdoms like Lordran and the fractured Drangleic. Letting the Flame die opens the door to a human-centered Age of Dark, but it substitutes uncertainty for the ordered tyranny of the gods. Usurpation proposes a third path, a new regime in which someone or something binds the Flame to human ends, potentially ending hollowing but risking a different kind of totalizing control. Each option is plausible within the world's internal logic, and each fits a recurrent historical phase found across the series: rise through sacrifice, decay and experimentation, and a contested terminal moment when an individual or faction decides the world's next shape. That is why the series ends on an ambiguous note rather than a tidy resolution. The timeline's strength is its pattern more than its endpoint. Cycles of construction and collapse, sacrificial solutions that become institutions, and periodic attempts to escape that then morph into fresh versions of the old problem. Dark Souls 3 gives the clearest expression of that theme, with the soul of Cinder and the threefold choice at the Flame. It makes the final act less about who is right and more about which structural gamble you are willing to accept for the future. There is no evidence inside the games that any one of these choices permanently abolishes the underlying dynamics. Instead, each ending rewrites the immediate phase of the timeline. A new loop begins, or a different loop is attempted, and uncertainty remains the series' final, intentional design. The clock keeps running until someone changes not just who holds the Flame, but the social and metaphysical rules that make the Flame the only option. The entire Dark Souls timeline is less a single, definitive history than a repeating pattern. The first Flame creates a world shaped by light and dark, and every age that follows is defined by how people respond. Rise comes through sacrifice. Institutions ossify around that sacrifice. Decay and forbidden experiments follow, and then a contested terminal moment forces a new choice. Dark Souls 3's Soul of Cinder and its three-way ending crystallize that dynamic: rekindle, usurp, or reshape. But none of the games show a permanent abolition of the cycle. Each ending rewrites the immediate phase, not the underlying rules that make the Flame the pivot of existence. That ambiguity is the timeline's power. It isn't about a single resolved past, but about recurring human decisions that remake the world. Dark Souls is a story of cycles shaped by the first Flame and our repeated choices. Its final verdict is the question it leaves open.